Thank you. So, the 2010 election is upon us. In a week, it will be over. There will be a new political reality. When the 2008 election ended, we had a very new political reality, and was I ever relieved? It was not that Obama won. It was that he cleared out of the neighborhood. You see, his house in Chicago is 2 blocks away from where my father has lived for the last 45 years. There were cops, there were cruisers, there were concrete barriers, there were Secret Service agents, there were helicopters overhead, there were detours and barricades that kept me from driving north in the direction of his home without first going south and then either east or west before I could turn around again. And I was glad for another reason. President Obama inhabits an in-between space, very similar to my own. He is impossible to categorize unless you fabricate or lie. He is neither this nor that. He does not fit very well into the box labeled black. His existence runs smack into a quintessential American problem, this propensity to racialize every issue. Now, if I describe someone whose father worked on the atomic bomb, whose mother's ancestors owned slaves, whose birth certificate says he is white, who is educated in a Swiss boarding school and married to a Canadian, and then asked you if this person is white or black, you'd look at me as if I was putting you on. But that person is me. I wrote the book In Between, Memoir of an Integration Baby, in order to talk about America's situation and my own. It's an exploration of what it's like to inhabit an in-between space that is neither this nor that and confounds categorizations. Now, if you ignore my color, you can't understand the oppressive social reality that impinges on African American life at every moment. And yet, if you notice only my color, you misread who I am. So too often, white folks seeing nothing but my color don't see me at all. Rather, I serve as this kind of magnet, attracting all the notions, some good, some bad, about blackness that lurks in their psyches. The words from the prologue to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man keep returning to me. You know it. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imaginations. Indeed, everything and anything except me. Except me. Except me. This theme runs through my book as well, but this evening, I'm going to focus more on America than on myself. Race is emotion-laden in this country. Why? See, psychologically speaking, because it reflects our earliest wound as a nation. It touches on this, and I touch on this in our first chapter of my memoir. And there I write this. Early America was no empty frontier waiting to be settled by Europeans. That myth helps us to evade the painful truth that the real American wilderness is a moral one. The genocide of Native Americans called black ducks by the English colonists Untitled was a sin compounded by the enslavement of kidnapped Africans called niggers as they were sold on the auction block. Deemed savages and brutes, neither group possessed any right a white man was bound to respect, and so Aboriginal land and African lifeblood fed the infant nation's avarice. Indeed, the Constitution, our country's most sacred document, guarantor of freedom, had slavery written into it. So, around this trauma, a complex formed. Its polarities are freedom and slavery. America stands for liberty and yet allowed and thrived on slavery. Having yet not figured out how to deal constructively with a tragic history in a way that would transform it, the tension continues to reside in our collective unconscious. Housed inside, rarely articulated, much less understood, and masked by the pretense that it has all been resolved now, it gets projected out there all the time. This process, one of which we are quite unaware, can be seen in our hypersensitivity to anything that touches on race. It's numinous. It's seizing our attention, raising our anxieties. So right here in Cambridge, let's talk about Professor Louis Gates and Officer Crowley. Now, it's hard to strip the elements of race from this encounter on a July day a year ago. Now, did the woman who called in, did she think she was being a responsible citizen in calling the police? Certainly. Does the neighbor call if it's a middle-aged white man trying to get into his house? I bet she's not sure. Can she escape the stereotypes of black men we all live with? It's unlikely. What posture does the officer take when he finds a middle-aged white man who's clearly made himself at home? How does Professor Gates react if his background does not include hundreds of years of abuse and the concomitant wariness? Can he simply ignore his conditioning? I think not. Another little passage from my book captures just how automatic it is. I'm in Northern California, trying and failing to hitch a ride on Route 70 through a forlorn rural scrubland. No cars in sight, just shimmering waves of heat rising from the asphalt. As the sun crept higher, I unstrapped my black umbrella from my backpack, opened it, and hid beneath its shade. Just then, a highway patrol car cruises by. I stiffen. It makes a U-turn. As it came back toward me, I remember all the times I've been stopped by cops. Car pulled up. The officer leaned over. From behind mirrored sunglasses, he says, "You'll never get a ride here. Hop in, I'll drop you at a better spot." I offer a big smile as I slid in next to him and just in case memorized the name on his badge. When he led me out south of Yuba City, he bought me a Coke. And as he drove away, I laughed at myself and readjusted my view of the world a little. Now, white folks need to know I can't turn that reaction off. But like Colin Powell, I also learned that to survive, I had better be clear about who has the gun and the power. I take charge by smiling, by being calm and accommodating. Professor Gates must know that. So what happened? Why did he forget? Now, it's hard to strip the race out of this story, but we can try to look beneath it. What do you have? You've got two alpha males. That is, two males, a renowned professor and a police sergeant who are used to being obeyed and deferred to. They instantly trigger one another. Still, perhaps common sense will prevail, but no. Gates is sick and tired, as well as sick and tired of it all. And the officer, I assume, is trapped in part by departmental protocol and his own reaction to being challenged. Boom, we have headlines, a presidential misstep, and three miserable men pretending not to be sharing a beer in the patio near the White House Rose Garden. Headlines. Headlines are a sure sign event speaks to our national complex. But just a couple of words. A simple banner, and our attention is riveted. Our emotions, our bias leap right to the fore. The problem with this racializing complex is that it often blinds us to the underlying issues. It makes news. It sells, but it mongers the truth. In fact, we often miss the truth altogether. And in America, if you see everything largely in terms of black and white, you're going to miss a whole lot. August 3rd of this year, Omar Thornton is fired and then rampages through the beer distributor in Connecticut where he worked. Is it about race? Before he took his own life, Omar Thornton said so in justifying his slaying his co-workers. That tells us how he felt, but does that mean it was true? The owner of the company says he did not discriminate. Does that mean it is true? Did he just hate white people? Given he had a white ex-girlfriend, it's doubtful, but we'll never know. What we know is that you don't kill people because you get fired. No more than you shoot your family when the bacon isn't cooked the way you like it. That's what happened. What? No one said anything when that happened because the issue around race, because they were all white. What do we know? That these are two angry men who can't cope with their life situations. Mystified. We cast about for explanations, we grasp for understanding, and often latch onto race, because it's always lurking, you see, in our psyches. And what do? Well, we substitute generalizations for the truth and disregard the facts. Easy. The complex is transracial. It captures us all, black and white, Hispanic or Anglo, wise or ignorant alike, get swept up. Take Shirley Sherrod, the Department of Agriculture employee who was assailed and fired this last June. Was it about racism? Well, it's about her overcoming her own bias and doing the right thing. But what happened? Well, a Tea Party blogger misrepresented what she said. The white farmer she helped defended her. The White House, the Department of Agriculture, and the NAACP had to eat a little crow, but mostly blame the blogger and Fox News. Is it about race or about the acrimonious political divide in America? Both? See, my point is that whenever race comes up, more likely than not, the exchange will be volatile and misguided. Why? Because it's a piece of unfinished, festering business. In 1936, Howard Thurman, the Reverend Howard Thurman, met Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi asked him whether the prejudice against color was growing or dying in America. Thurman replied that it was difficult to say, since in one place things looked to improve, while in another place the outlook was dark. What is the answer 75 years later? Are we living in a post-racial era? Well, the answer is still yes and no. I mean, if we're on, the direction we're headed in is absolutely clear. There's no question about the direction we're going. America is moving toward becoming a transracial, multicultural society, and it's been moving in that direction for 400 years. The naysayers are simply yielding hyperbole in search of political gain. But still, from the perspective, don't you think of 1965, so prior to the Voting Rights Act, it was impossible to foresee Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Alberto Gonzalez, impossible to predict Super Bowl coaches Tony Dungy or Mike Tomlin, much less President Obama. But I want you to forget your perspectives. Forget your perspectives. Long ones, they are not the one that matter. The one that will count in the long run is that of the preschoolers who know, not cognitively, but viscerally, that the president is a black man, and the woman their mother watches on TV every day is who? Oprah. Oprah. At this moment in America, the two major iconic figures are African Americans. To quote Martin Luther King Jr., paraphrasing Theodore Parker, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Nonetheless, our ongoing reactivity to the issue of race is obvious. The old wound is still tender, the scab keeps getting ripped off, and so we keep racializing issues that are much broader and becoming less and less an issue of race. Poverty, the income gap, the disappearing middle class, immigration reform. Right after President Obama's inauguration, when hope still ran high, I wrote a column that appeared in the Washington Post online. It's worth repeating because it's part of the answer to the problem I've been ruminating about this evening. The headline above it read, "We need a national fast day," I wrote. The first time I attended a Passover Seder, I was 13. As an African American, celebrating one's deliverance from slavery made sense to me. For some in my family, slavery was a taboo topic. My great-grandmother refused to talk about it. My grandmother denied that anyone in our family had been a slave. But my great-aunt Irene, who never let details get in the way of a good story, talked freely. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had set my great-grandmother free. Just as the Jews celebrate their deliverance at Passover, we Americans celebrate our democratic principles on the 4th of July. But I believe that we African Americans, if we African Americans are to overcome our sense of ambivalence about America, more is required. Since President Obama is given to invoking Lincoln, I suggest that he follow Lincoln's lead and proclaim, as Lincoln did in 1863 and in 1864, a national day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. Why a fast day in addition to Martin Luther King Jr. Day? The religious act of fasting was once a national custom, a custom which ended with Lincoln's assassination. What I propose is not just another holiday, but rather a day of contrition and somber reflection. America is a great nation built on Aboriginal land, African lifeblood, Chinese coolie labor, Japanese internment, and Mexican immigrant labor. Just as we honor our principles, presidents, and veterans, we need to honor all those who were sacrificed. If on such a day we together acknowledge and grieve our failures, past and ongoing, might not Americans set out the next day to make it right? Over 50 years ago, James Baldwin wrote that the history of the American Negro problem is not merely shameful, it is also something of an achievement. For even when the worst has been said, it must also be added that the perpetual challenge posed by this problem has always somehow been perpetually met. Obama's presidency attests to the correctness of Baldwin's insight and his conclusion that it is precisely this black-white experience that may prove of indispensable value to us in the world we face today. Americans resonate with Barack Obama's refrain, "Yes, we can," because we believe change is always possible and that hope will prevail. What began as the American Revolution has been and remains an ongoing revolution, one that saw slaves freed and women enfranchised. A national fast day would serve as a sobering reminder that the American Revolution is yet unfinished and that the future rests in our hands. I still think it's a great idea. I'm just waiting for the president to call me. Thank you.
You're listening to Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion of In Between, Memoir of an Integration Baby, with Unitarian Universalist minister Mark Morrison-Reed. Thank you, Mark, for your insights and your generosity of spirit. As moderator, I have the daunting privilege of asking the first question. This church, First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, is joyfully embarked on a journey into the borderlands of race and culture toward a multiracial, multicultural, justice-making future. But some who vigorously support this journey object to using words like race and multicultural because race has no inherent reality, no biological basis. They are more than willing to talk about racism, but they say that using the word race or multiracial endorses and reinforces a flawed and indeed racist paradigm. They would prefer we talk about color, culture, or ethnicity, not race. Has the time come to stop using the words race and multiracial? And if not now, when?
There is a problem with the language of race. So if I say African American, what does it mean? If we refer to Obama is certainly an African American. In a way, I'm not. What does he have? He had Kenyan Muslim father and a white mother from Kansas, right? So he is African American, but he's not African American the way Obama is an African American. So we use the same term, but what does it tell you? Does it tell you that he grew up in Hawaii? Did it tell you that he spent his formative years in Indonesia? Did it tell you that he didn't come to the mainland until he was 18 and fully formed? It tells you nothing about Obama. That's the problem with the language of African American, what does it mean? Hispanic, what does it mean? Are you talking about, well, what are you talking about? Chicano? Are you talking about Puerto Rican? I mean, what does it, that broad stuff, and with that, we're not even talking about race. We're talking about culture. So yes, we need to talk about it, and it's a conundrum, and I don't have the answers to that one because it's a tough one. And I wonder how important it is.
You're listening to Mark Morrison-Reed discussing his memoir, In Between.
It's a tough one.
Now let's take some questions from the audience. Please come forward and line up at the microphone. And please limit yourself to one succinct question to allow us as many people as possible to speak.
Hi. My name is Paula Kaplan, and I'm a project director of Voices of Diversity project. We just have been studying racism and sexism in predominantly white universities. And the question I have for you sort of bears on what you were just talking about. What we heard interviewing students of color in 4 very different universities in this country was an enormous amount of silent suffering that's continuing because of the racism and sexism. And so I understand what you're saying about race and how it's much more complicated than race. But when people are still mistreated because of what others assume about their race and what goes along with that, then I worry. And what I wanted to ask you to address, if you would, is the whole matter of microaggression, because when I was coming of age in the late 60s and early 70s, all of a sudden there were things you weren't allowed to say, the most blatant forms of racism. But what we were hearing from the current university students are the subtler forms that make them ask the kinds of questions. All right, what just happened there? Did they mean that? Was that racist, or was it sexist? Or did they just not like me? Or was it just a joke? And what do I do about that? And the enormous emotional drain that is going on in these students who then are not sure, whom can I talk to about this? So that the subtleties and the complexities and the nuance seem to be causing an enormous amount of pain. I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yes. You can't know. That's always the issue. You don't know why it happened. You don't know if the person's just a jerk. You don't know if they're a racist. You don't know if you're a jerk. I mean, how do you know? You can't untangle it. And it would be nice to untangle it. It would be nice to say, well, that's what it was. But you can't know what the other person brought to it outside of a discussion, outside of a dialogue, which you may or may not be able to have. But what you always at least can try to create is some place where the person who was wounded can express that, can ventilate, can have a place to process what it felt like, their doubts. I mean, young people, they're away from home for the first time. This is a new context. Many of them may or may not have been around a lot of white folks. And then the stuff's coming out, and they don't know how to read it, what's going on. And then they have no place to talk about it. And I think that's the hard question, is creating spaces in which people can have the conversation. Both those who say the things, but most important, those people who are wounded by what gets directed toward them. If they have a place and they can find their internal strength, then the projections, which is what they're dealing with, they have to let them go. They have to let it wash over them and say, that's where that person's at. That it doesn't have anything to do with them. So in some ways and the book is a lot it was about me going inside and inside deeper and deeper to find myself so that I could, once I was rooted in myself and my goodness and my competence and my abilities, well, they could see anything they pleased. Because it often didn't have anything to do with me. Except for me, I was lucky. Because my background was such, I knew what they were talking about and seeing didn't have anything to do with who I was. I mean, it was transparently clear I wasn't out of a ghetto. I wasn't working class. I wasn't poor. I mean, who of them white kids had a Swiss education? Now, for me, I got the same trouble thing that happens, of course, is African-American kids direct the same stuff at you. Because they've got a series of expectations about how you're supposed to behave. And if you don't behave the same way, they're going to ostracize you. There's going to be social pressure to fall in line. It's not just white kids that are doing this. There's a lot of intergroup pressure to fall in line. So my experience wasn't just it was just them. It was actually African-American kids were directing stuff at me. And I grew up when you did, in the middle of the Black Power thing, and most of my friends are white. And they all knew it. They think they'd trust me? No, they didn't trust me. And I didn't sit at the black table. So I walked in the college union. There's the table. And everybody's there. All black folks are there. And I scan the room, and all black folks are there. But my roommate's over there, and I've got to decide. Am I going to sit with black guys today, or am I going to get to sit over there? I have to decide. Every time I have to decide. And if I don't sit there and play bid whist, join the banter, well, they're like, so I stop and I go sit over there, but in my heart, I'm still looking at what's going over there. I can't cut it off. I described that piece. So it's not even just black, white. That's part of the oversimplification. Black kids do it to themselves. Is that it? You're nodding on that, but that's okay. Okay, yeah. So, next question. Yes, please, come.
I don't really know how to say this, because I guess you said it without saying it. If we don't have middle-class housing security with middle-class education, and then middle class or upper middle class. No one should be, middle class. It's a world of fame and privilege for some. But the security of upper middle and the housing and the employment and the good industry and no more. What about that? That abuses the poor, who tend to be mostly black.
But they're not mostly black. If you take absolute numbers, no question about it. Most of the poor people in this country are Euro-Americans. There's no question about that. If we address the issue of poverty and fairness in society, let's forget Hispanic, forget black. If we address that problem, then we deal with some of the other issues. But that's one of the mistakes.
Overwhelming.
But it's not even overwhelming. But it's not even overwhelming among his.
Well, let's eliminate all white and black ghettos. And why can't it be done by government?
Because it's an issue of the heart, part of it's social, but
I can't say what I want.
some of it's structural, and some of it is we perpetuate ourselves from out of our. It's fear-based. It's fear-based. Okay, so people who are hard-pressed are scared. People who are poor are hard-pressed, and they're scared, and they actually pull in. And anything that looks like a threat, they're going to reject. Any group that's not their group, they're going to keep at arm's length. And it's what we see politicians often do is playing to a culture of fear. And if we have to break out of that culture, and Obama had some success, and I don't mean to politicize this, but he had some success in holding up hope. And when we have hope, there's something we move toward. And we actually are more open. We're more emotionally open when we have hope. And we're scared, we shut down. And that politicians play to that to stay in power.
It's so frustrating just looking at the Boston Globe, a police blotter about Dorchester, and no real education and work waiting.
But education and work are are transracial issues. They're transracial issues. Yes.
You've been talking a lot about categories, and the categories we impose on ourselves and the categories that society imposes on us. And I know that you spent your 26 years in ministry in Canada, where the categories may be a little bit different. And I wonder if you could compare Canada and the United States.
Well, this feeds into what I was just saying. I've been in Canada since 1988. You know, Canadians, by and large, are mystified that there is any debate about universal health care. They scratch their heads when they see their American friends. They don't even know we don't get it. There's no politician in Canada that could get elected on a policy of getting rid of universal health care. Now, when you have universal health care, when you have education, well, I'll talk about education, where you have education that's affordable, not that it hasn't gone up, but my daughter came to go to college. She got into University of Toronto, and she got into University of Chicago. And the difference for her parents was between $50,000 for 4 years and $160,000 for 4 years. So when she decided to go to Toronto, thank God. When you have affordable education, when you have health care, you're not so hard pressed. You're not driven by fear all the time, and it makes for a kinder, gentler society. It's not that there aren't racial problems, but they're not of the, and they're different there. We can't make same assumptions, and we have significant. Actually, Canada has gone the way that America is going to have to go eventually, because as Euro-Americans become the minority before the turn of the century, we're going to have to. This whole ball game is going to change, and we're going to have conversations and making speaking Spanish illegal. Those laws are all going to get voted out. And we're going to have a conversation more like between the Anglos and the French, the Quebecois. That's one of the conversations you're going to have here that we've already had. It's a kinder, gentler, not perfect place. But it's not as fear-driven. And that's, I think, part of the reality here. And the question is, how do you address the fear? How do you give people hope? And so a huge part of the thing is it spiritual? These are spiritual issues. They're not gonna, how do I say, they're not, if we could have solved them, we would have solved them. But I have some hunch that we're going at this the wrong way. But I'll stop, because I'm a bit lost. Hello.
I had a question for you.
Yes.
The Obama winning, was it a racial win, or was it the ability of that campaign to utilize the high tech that was so very new on harassing? Because I didn't view it as a racial thing. I viewed it as one campaign beat the other one to the utilization of that high tech.
This is my take on the Obama campaign. What do we, do you remember the campaign at one point, Michelle said something about, this is the first time I'm proud of my country? And there was a huge uproar, and the accusation was that she was not patriotic. Now, Obama would never say that. Barack could not say that, because that's not his experience. It's her experience, because what do we know about her ancestors? They were slaves. So, And he doesn't have that experience, and so he couldn't speak to that. What was his experience? He grew up where again? Hawaii. Who was around him all the time? His white grandparents and mother. His father was gone by the time he was 2. He's completely at home with Euro-Americans. He doesn't carry that angry edge that many African Americans carry. And so he didn't trigger this. Whites and blacks do a dance kind of around black anger and white guilt. And he doesn't do that dance because he doesn't know how to do that dance because it's not his background. So he had a chance because he wasn't triggering millions and millions of Euro-Americans. This is not a conscious thing. It's intuitive. He didn't trigger that. There's a story, and I don't know if it's true or apocryphal, but there's something, I've heard it many times, that someone was canvassing in backwoods Pennsylvania, came to the door, canvassing for Obama, and said, "I'm here for Obama. I'd like to know who your household is voting for." And the woman of the house said, "Hon, who are we voting for?" And the voice comes back, says, "We're voting for that nigger fella." Now, I don't know if it's true, but what it captures is that and this had to happen, there are a lot of people, some of us call rednecks, or we think of retrograde, who looked at McCain and saw him representing what had been going on in terms of the government, the finances, the oncoming recession at that point, the war, and said, do we want more of that, or do we well, this guy sounds all right, and he's not triggering these folks. Okay, he's talking about hope. He's talking about maybe we can do more, and made a different decision. Now, how do you explain that decision by all these people that we would think and have been put to fear or scared now, but at that moment said, okay, let's try this because this other thing's not working, and looked beyond his race. And he was giving hope. Someone says there's only 2 kind of races, those who appeal to fear and those who appeal to hope. And people chose hope and didn't take his race into account. And it's the only way you can. And I'm very hopeful because it says the racism we think of as fixed is mutable. Enough people said, here's my racism and here's my self-interest. And they voted for what they thought there was their self-interest. That is what we think of as fixed racism actually is much more flexible, and people will always choose their self-interest over racism. So I've talked around your question, but that's my take on what happened there. That he actually, because of his background, didn't trigger Euro-Americans the way, say, Jesse Jackson would. Not that Jesse Jackson's anything wrong with Jesse Jackson, but he has that edge. Obama doesn't have that edge. Just, yes.
Had an extraordinary silver spoon in his mouth when he was born. And the reason I say that, he was lucky enough to have a mother who had a PhD in anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going some. I don't think there are a lot of anthropologists even now in the United States. So if you hit lucky enough to have a mother with a PhD in anthropology way back then, I think it's going to be hard to compare you with a lot of people and then to end up at Harvard and the whole bit. So to me, he was just
yes.
lucky.
I don't think we were ready for. Except, no, I must say we obviously were ready because we did it. But in the normal course of things, had not this unique individual presented himself, no, we weren't ready. Absolutely. But he emerged. Because there's more and more African Americans. I mean, I'm 10 years older than he is at least. But how many African Americans his father worked on the atomic bomb? I mean, right. I mean, I have a similar background, and so I identify with him.
Well, sir, I just wanted to ask you one more question
Yes.
since I'm here. I'm 73 years old, and I grew up in the real rurals of Alabama under
Right.
real Jim Crow. Real
Right.
Jim Crow.
Right.
And now I live next door to the church where Kennedy had his funeral.
Right.
And I've lived in that community for 38 years. And I've been trying to do a lot of observation about, there's a lot of crime in the area, black crime, a lot of women in poverty, a lot of abuse of the mentally ill. But this is my question to you. When I first came to Boston, went to Fisk University, the whole bit, I was so afraid of white Americans, especially white men. I was just kind of terrified of them, had no trust. It was just the enemy to me, right? As I moved through life and started to ask a few questions and went into a project trying to answer a few things, do you know what happened, sir? I got more help from that white man than I did when I walked in the other direction.
Of course.
And that has just floored me. And what I've learned quietly in my mind, when I look at white men now, and you can correct me if I'm not correct, that white man has carried the burden of the United States culture. And what I mean by that is that how well that culture is evolving, how it's being sustained, he basically is carrying it on his shoulder. So let me see, can I explain a little bit? I see them, please let me say this, they sacrifice their social lives, right? While they're reading, they're writing, they'll put their shoulders to this, just to keep the culture going. My question is to you, when will we, as a black race, meet them halfway? Now, it's true, I heard 1%ers say they botched the slavery. They didn't really give us freedom because they ran down the street and put Jim Crow up. And one of the first things, the way I understand it, they tapped into not allowing us to learn the language. Because they know if we know the language and if we can speak the way they speak, that we can kind of qualify for that culture.
Okay.
So why is it that we resist learning that language now and meeting them halfway? What I'm going to do as a black American, I'm going to take every opportunity that I can to develop a brain, develop a heart, and do what I need to do with my hands to meet him halfway. And I'm not going to allow him to say that I don't know his language, that I'm not engaged. And so I just wondered when we will embrace the idea, well, he did this, he did that, but let's meet him halfway.
Okay. I'm not gonna.
You keep talking, you've mentioned triggers. I've noticed one thing. Dealing with people, let's say white people, who are part of a institution that is part of a racist institution, institutional racism, and we try to have a conversation about racism, two things happen. Either they say they're afraid they're going to be called racist, and so the conversation stops at the fear of being called a racist, or else they take on the racist and say, oh, I'm such a bad racist. They take out the hair shirt, the whip, and all this. So how do you restart the conversation? Both things tend to end the conversation at that point. How do you restart it?
Right. It's all fear. Okay, let me, I think I'm going to voyage, but stick with me. Have a seat and stick with me. My understanding of racism and why the conversation is so hard to have. What do we know about babies? What do they need? They need to be held, fed, have diapers changed, and have their goodness mirrored back to them so they know that they're the most wonderful thing in the world. Does a baby care if you have polka dots? Does the baby care if you're green? I don't think so. If those other things get met, baby's gonna think green is wonderful. Think polka dots is wonderful. They just, okay. What else are any of those babies racist? No one here was born racist. It is not possible. It is not possible. That's not your essential self. That's the first piece you have to hold on to in this conversation, that no one was born this way. What do we know about kids? By the time they're 1.5, 2, you can't, this time of year, you can't walk down the street without them seeing every leaf is fascinating. Red, yellow, you can't get anywhere because what do they think about the world? World is wonderful. They see you with your cane. Why do you use a cane? Why are you bald? They just, now and then they fall where they're exploring, they run back to mother, they're comforted, they say, it's okay, I love you, and then they're not gonna stay there, they go back out. That's our essential nature, to be open to difference. We should find, other cultures should be absolutely fascinating to us. So we're not born racist. We find the world absolutely marvelous and fascinating and want to take in of it as much as we possibly can. That's our basic nature. Third thing, what do we know about kids? What can they smell? Fairness. I think kids know when something's not fair, whether it's race or gender or whatever. They know very quickly. That's not. I knew every crumb my brother got on his cake that I didn't get. We're attuned to that. And they notice. And my hunch is when the first time they see racism or sexism, they probably say something. They say, well, why did that happen? And if it's a liberal parent, they get this uncomfortable, they learn, well, I don't ask because my parent's going to get uncomfortable. It's embarrassment they have to deal with. If the parent's, what we say, is a bigot, the kid may get smacked. Kid, in any case, learns, don't go there. How many times does that happen? Not once, not twice. It happens thousands of times because it is not who you are. And you learn that there's a cost to saying that, and you don't do it again. And then eventually, because you want your parents to love you, you fall into line around their attitudes. Or because the gang you hang with has certain attitudes, you fall in. It is not the way any of us is. Nobody would choose this. No one would choose to be separated and not to be able to be open and in touch. So it's fear-based, it's enforced on us. And if people can begin to accept that this was not their choice, that they don't have to feel bad, they don't have to prove themselves, I can beat myself, or I'm gonna be more politically correct than you can. If they can kind of relax and say, okay, I don't know how to do it right. And the other part of that is they're all scared of making mistakes. Because what? Because they don't want to deal with all those feelings. Because they're going to, I'm a liberal. If I make a mistake, I'm going to look bad. And I can't deal, my ego can't deal with it. I don't want to look bad, so I'm going to fake it. I'm going to fake that I'm liberal. They do it all the time. Rather than go ahead, you got to make mistakes. That's the only way to learn. Kids all learn by making mistakes. But when it comes to race, none of us, especially white folks, want to make any mistakes. Of course, black folks don't either. Don't want to make any mistakes. Because I'm going to feel bad. I'm going to be embarrassed. I'm going to have to go home. I have to deal with these feelings. They're old feelings. So we pretend. We pretend all the time rather than have the real conversation. So then you get all the stuff you're talking about. Like, well, let's not talk about it, or let's talk about it, or I'm cool, but it's them, let's go get them, because I'm more righteous. I'm more righteous than they are. So why is that about? Because I want to feel good about myself. That's all it is, that our egos are much more delicate than we want to admit. And so at some point we have to admit our vulnerability, say this is hard work, I'm going to make mistakes, but it is not my essential self. I want out of this, and I'm going to do whatever I have to do and make as many mistakes as I have to make to be free of the shackles of the virus that is racism. It's a sickness. And when we see it as a sickness, it's nobody's fault. It's something we caught because it's in the texture of society. No one here would ever want to do it that way. Is that? Thank you.
That was very hopeful, and I'd like you to talk about another topic that I hope is also hopeful. You talked a little bit about babies, and you talked about children and the new generation and how different their experience is from yours and mine growing up, in a basically segregated world. How will things change over the course of a generation? Will it take longer? Put on your predictor's hat now and talk about how the new multicultural world that our children are living in is going to bring change.
I have two stories for you. First story, I was in Selma, Alabama 2 years ago, February. Never been to the South. Terrified of the South. Terrified of the South. And after a couple of days, I had to let that go because it didn't make any sense. I mean, one thing was, I remember we got the bus I was on, got pulled over by a cop, and the cop came and got the bus, and we froze. Well, it's a black cop, and he just pulled us over to tell us that his wife couldn't meet us because she was supposed to give us a tour. But all my stuff immediately came up, right? So we're in Selma, Alabama, at Brown Chapel, where the whole, about Selma, Alabama, the Brown Chapel, the voting rights thing. So there had been the march led on what became Bloody Sunday. The marchers were beaten. The whole nation responded. King called the clergy down. Hundreds of clergy went to participate in the march. Eventually, then James Reed was killed. At that point, Johnson intervened. Johnson made the speech to Congress saying, "We shall overcome," and then pushed through the Voting Rights Act. So I'm standing there in front of Brown Chapel, and I hear this, and I look down the street, and there's some motorcycles coming, and there's some more motorcycles, and then I look, and they're being led by motorcycle cops, 2 white, 1 black. And there's more of them. And they keep coming. And the whole street is full of these cyclists. And they pull up in front of Brown Chapel. Well, these aren't just any bikes. These are Honda Goldwings. These are Harley Davidsons. These are BMW Roadmasters. I mean, these are big bikes, expensive bikes. And all these folks, if they got a bike, they probably got a van too. This has got to be the middle class. 300 of them. And they get off the bikes. They're on the black leathers. And they walk in, and I see on the back of their leather, black leather, buffalo soldiers. And they're all black. All of them are black. And I thought, when they were marching in Selma, they could not have possibly envisioned that. They could not possibly have envisioned that you were going to have 300, had to be solidly middle-class Americans coming down there, riding the roads as they wanted. They didn't know that's what they were fighting for. So we can never know when we're doing these things what the outcome was. It wasn't just about the vote. It was about the vote. After it got passed, there was in the black belt, all of a sudden you had all kinds of black officials, but it was also about class issues and African Americans getting a chance to have some wealth. But other parts is we can't foretell. We enter into it because we're called to do it because we think it's right. We can't know the outcome, and we shouldn't know the outcome, because the outcome is going to become between us working together. And so to prejudge what's going to emerge besides us acting on our principles for justice is to actually damage it. So we work together, something beautiful will emerge. And we have to have that faith, because to me, it's absolutely clear when in Jamestown, you had the first English colonists, and they interact, and then the Aboriginals, and then the African indentured slaves came in, what we're talking about, 1619. We had the three races, and you can't get from 1619 to 2010 and a black president. You can't do it. There's no way to, but somehow this nation, as Baldwin said, has managed to live up to its principles, not in a straight line. But those principles, in fact, have predominated. And we do have a substantial black middle class, and when we focus too much on racism, we ignore the issue of poverty. So I look at my kids. Their friendship network, I stopped asking because they were embarrassed. I'm thinking in my old 60s mentality, and they're like, Dad, what's, they got Guyanese friends and Tamil friends and Chinese friends, and I can't make any sense about the Chinese friends. We're at dinner. Well, one's from Taiwan, one's from Hong Kong, and the other's family has lived in Newfoundland since 1949, which was before Newfoundland was part of Canada. Now, I can't make any assumptions about them. Yes, they look Asian, but to make any assumptions about them is to go wrong. And my kids roll their eyes, like, oh, Dad. This is not part of their world. And so it is evolving. I am completely confident about where we're headed in the general picture. I don't know exactly how we're going to get there. I don't know what it's going to look, but my intuition, when I was a child, I used to think about God, and I wonder what God looked like. And I thought about, Watusis, they were tall, and pygmies, and people from Sweden, and people fair skin, and long noses, and broad noses, and I thought, well, what's God? What's God? I mean, it wouldn't be right or fair for God to be any one of those groups. And maybe at eight or so, I kind of came to the conclusion that God was some mixture I could not imagine. Some mixture that we were moving toward together. And in a million years, somewhere we get there. And I rested easy with that. And that was my child, very concrete sense of dealing. But I think that intuition was correct. That we're heading towards something we can't imagine. But the arc of the universe, the direction, is absolutely clear. There is no question about it, where we're headed.